Welcome, Matthew, and thank you so much. You were the inspiration for me putting this panel together tonight, and I'd love to hear what your perspective is on the blockchain in the enterprise companies.
Well, I think that's a very broad question. I mean, I think that we're beginning to see the blockchain has applications across most industries and therefore most large companies. And right now, we're still at the formative stage where people are beginning to explore what those opportunities are and how to most efficiently take advantage of them. And we haven't yet had too many large-scale deployments. So I think there are very few large companies whose IT teams are not beginning to take a look at blockchain and what it might do for them, and more importantly, distributed ledgers and what they might do for the corporation. But we're still in a phase where there are not very many roadmaps or sort of examples to leverage as you go about trying to figure out what to do in the context of your own company.
And I did approach IBM because I know Donald Thabeau there, and unfortunately he wasn't available for tonight, but I know that they have done a lot of work on the blockchain. What's your thoughts about that?
Well, broadly, any large technology IT organization that makes its living out of bringing new technologies to enterprises is, of course, going to be taking a look at blockchain. And so whether it's IBM or Capgemini or Deloitte, these companies are in the business of bringing new technology to the enterprise. And this is a whole new area, a new protocol, brings a lot of opportunity. And so you shouldn't be surprised that the IT organizations are at the forefront of exploration and also telling the story and building the business case. I think IBM has done a great job of being one of those foremost companies, and they're definitely moving very quickly to try and connect to the world's largest companies, the Walmarts and the JP Morgans and the Maersks and others, to try and figure out how to deploy blockchain in actual enterprise settings. But they're not the only ones. So the same could be said of the large accounting firms, the PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Deloittes, the large systems integrators, the large technology companies, the HPs and the Ciscos. I think all of them are beginning to look at this space.
And it's quite well known that corporates are slow to change, and it's difficult to incorporate change, possibly because they're so massive and they have massive systems in place already. What do you think the key is for bringing a disruptor like the blockchain into the mix?
Right. So I think that large companies have big businesses and they can't stop them. Yes. So, this isn't a situation where you can pivot to a new technology platform fast. I think that and I'll talk more about this in our panel, but I think that the best model is to take a look at the internet and how electronic commerce and the other applications that we built on top of the early TCP/IP and the other internet-based protocols, how those technologies were rolled out. And so if you go back to the early 90s, most large companies were beginning to scout out online electronic commerce, online communications and so on. But it took a while to figure out how to first begin to play with them. And so we had the first round of sort of the online shopping, for example, as a bolt-on business. And we then began to talk about clicks and mortar, where it was sort of two channels connected together. And today, in most cases, it's pretty much fully integrated. And I think that is not a bad model for blockchain either. You can't sort of stop the presses and pivot to a new technology platform. So the first go round, you probably want to have some exploration and apply blockchain either as a standalone business or to aspects of your business that are maybe not so critical and can be, or it could be geographies, products, services, other pieces where perhaps you can take some risk, new businesses, and so on. And then as the learning increases, I think the right time will come when you can begin to bring the whole thing together into an integrated fashion. But I don't think that there's going to be too many Fortune 1000 companies that pivot to a blockchain-enabled solution in the next 3 to 5 years. I think it's a long-term undertaking.
And so really, I guess we're relying on all of the startup community to actually bring the blockchain to a higher level, in the sense that that's what startups do. They can pivot and they can adopt new technologies quickly and are often very open to them. So do you think that that's where the start of things will come from?
I think that what's different this time around is that the next proximate protocols, if you will, have already been brought into the large enterprise. So the internet is at this point leveraged and used by almost every company, large company in the world. And most of those companies are well down the path to embracing the open internet and the cloud in the way they do business. Not all of them, but most of them are well down that path and understand it, use it, deploy it, and so on. And in many respects, blockchain is a continuation of that digitization of our economy and our world. I don't see it as being as big a challenge in some respects as the first round in the early 90s of deploying the digital economy into the large enterprise, where I think that when we first tried to do that, that was really a big conceptual breakthrough and a lot of work. I think that for most large IT organizations, the idea of beginning to take another step forward and bringing distributed ledgers and blockchain technologies and registers and other things into the business, it doesn't feel quite so disruptive and dramatic. Now, the other half of your question is, I think, the bleeding edge of technology is almost always first put to effect by innovators and startups. And of course, the failure rate is very high. So I do think that the bleeding edge of most technology should be left to startups, and large companies should be thoughtful and careful because they have existing clients, existing products, existing services, and they can't afford to just disrupt all of that at a whim. So I personally do, in most industry sectors, would say being a fast follower, but not the bleeding edge of technology, is the better strategy. And I think that's true in blockchain too. So there are ways for large companies to begin to play at the leading edge without themselves committing their entire, sort of established business to the endeavor. And I think we're seeing a lot of smart corporations beginning to do some of those tactics and strategies.
So it's quite an interesting time we live in. As you said, that big companies can get involved in some ways, and the startups are obviously going to be the sacrifices and the ones that probably will get to the finish line first. So it is different than when the internet happened. It was a bigger chasm to jump, really, wasn't it? Yeah.
I think so. But I also think, you said get to the finish line first, and I just want to question. I think that having a prototype business up and running is very different from have a fully scaled global deployment to tens of millions or hundreds of millions of customers and so on. So I think the question of who gets to the finish line first depends upon how you define the finish line. And I think what we saw in the case of the internet was an electronic commerce, or digital content for that matter. I mean, there's a lot of pieces to that puzzle. The people that really got to the finish line were, to a large extent, large established companies. And the exceptions are obviously the household names, so Amazon or Apple or Google. These companies built entire new businesses off the back of the internet. But in most categories, established companies are today electronic commerce players too, and most of the dot-coms cease to exist. So, for example, in FinTech, just to use that as an example, we had 400 or 450 FinTech startups in the dot-com boom. PayPal continues to be an independent company. A few of them sold for very large sums of money, like E-Trade and Ameritrade and so on. But the vast majority of the FinTech startups failed. And then conversely, if you look at any established bank, it has an online presence, a mobile presence. It's leveraging the internet in the way it goes about doing business. So I do think that with blockchain, when the dust settles, we'll find that large companies embrace it. And I think there will be some very big startups that succeed too. And then the big question mark in my head is over this question of decentralization via the continuation of more of a centralized business model. And I'm not sure how that plays out.
It's always good not to know everything about the future, isn't it? Because then we get to be surprised.
Thank you for whispering in my ear.
Thank you.
I'm on my chariot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and I'm really looking forward to the panel.
Yeah, and me too. Thank you very much.